Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 2015 biography by Garry Boulard, The Worst President, The Story of James Buchanan. Alright, Garry Boulard, from what I can gather, appears to be a Louisiana-based journalist who has written a series of journalistic pieces that have appeared in both local publications and national publications. And he also seems to be a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none biographer, starting with subjects that have a local connection to New Orleans. He's a particular interest to me is his biography of Louis Prima, which from what I can gather is one of the only ones out there, if not maybe the only proper biography of the man. So no doubt as we continue further into this project, I may end up having to reference more of his works. But since then, he has written works on Huey Long, and then he has kind of gotten into this phase where he has started writing biographies of lesser known presidents. You have biographies of Franklin Pierce and Andrew Johnson that have been released to minimal acclaim, I suppose. They're not exactly super popular biographies, understandable perhaps given that they're not super popular subjects. And this Buchanan one appears to be the most recent of this series of biographies that he has written. Now, James Buchanan, it's kind of fascinating when we think of this era of presidents, apart from Abe Lincoln obviously being very unpopular by biographical subjects. In a way, James Buchanan feels like someone who should receive more attention than he does, for the simple fact that, at least until very recently, a lot of people have considered him to be almost unquestionably the worst president in the history of the United States of America. Buchanan, of course, it started out in kind of local politics in Pennsylvania before emerging to become a relatively well-known senator and congressman out of Pennsylvania during the 1830s and 40s. Not necessarily a go-getter per se, but a bit of a mover and shaker. And because of his prominence in the Northeast, became a popular candidate for president, in the sense that he was considered for the nomination in several elections. Ultimately was passed up because, again, I think a lot of people sort of tended to look past him in the sense of, again, not being necessarily a go-getter or the most publicly charismatic person in the world, although from what I understand, he was, at least in a private sense, actually pretty charismatic. And finally, in 1856, he wins the presidential election over John Fremont and proceeds to oversee the dissolution of the United States in many senses. I think the overall perception of Buchanan's presidency is that basically more or less every decision that he made during this period of time that dealt directly with the potential secession crisis and slavery and everything connected to that, every decision that he made was the wrong one. And as the Democratic Party itself started to kind of split apart because there were multiple different perspectives on how to handle this crisis, of course, that results in the 1860 election. Buchanan's not even considered for the 1860 election because of how unpopular he's become. The Democratic Party splits into two different sections, and because of that, the Republicans end up winning that election with Abraham Lincoln, and the rest, as they say, is history. And Buchanan's life, I mean, there's an interesting note in kind of the advertisement for this book about how even after Buchanan's death in 1868, Congress was very torn as far as how to properly, I guess, address him and how to properly sort of speak to his quote-unquote accomplishments, because he was a U.S. president on the one hand, but on the other hand, of course, they're still only a few years removed from the war that he did very little to stop and arguably accelerated in some sense. And so they end up coming out with this milquetoast statement about how he contributed to public policy or something along those lines. My point overall with this is that Buchanan's story is an interesting one, even if the man himself is kind of an enigma. not the most interesting character in the world, a bit Millard Fillmore like in that sense. Of course, there's all the rumors. This, I think, is actually an appeal here. All the rumors about Buchanan possibly being homosexual, possibly having relationships with different people in the political scene that were kind of covered up. We obviously know he was our only bachelor president, as it were. All these things make for a potentially interesting biographical subject, but very few people have had the interest in taking this on, and those who have not done a super great job of it. I think I understand there is a biography in the works that is going to be released in a couple of years that appears pretty promising. But until then, this Garry Bullard book, from what I have read and the reviews that I have read, is apparently the best that we have. Certainly the best that we've seen released in the last 50 years. And if that's true, then that's pretty pathetic. This is a contender for the worst biography that I have read as a part of this presidential biographies dive overall. And this is not to do with the writing being shockingly bad or anything like that. I don't think the writing is anything to write home about here. I don't think it is a discredit to Bullard's name as a journalist, and I'm certainly open to reading other things that he's written over time. My issue with this book is just in the approach. I understand that maybe you were lacking a little bit for materials with Buchanan, but that doesn't excuse what is ultimately, not including index, bibliography, appendices, or anything else, what is ultimately a 128-page book. Hardly feels like a real biography just due to length. And I think the first 20 or so pages takes you through all of Buchanan's life up to the presidential election. This book is really about the Buchanan's presidency. And there are still, even with that said, so you have the first 20 or so pages that are about, the 60 some odd years of Buchanan's life until he becomes president. That leaves about 100 pages to go through his presidency, and there are still plenty of pages where there is a complete detour from what Buchanan himself was doing and giving readers background information about things that Buchanan was not necessarily involved in, with maybe giving a sentence or two of throwing in what Buchanan's thoughts were on major events like, the Dred Scott decision or the raid of Harper's Ferry, that sort of thing. And it just, the way that it comes across, God bless the guy, the author here, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful. God bless him for trying to, write about a topic and an individual who is historically rather undercovered. And he talks in his introduction about how he's thankful to, he pulled all-nighters to research this or whatever the hell. But boy, this feels like a rush job. This feels like something that was either completely sped out of production, worked on in the span of a month or two. And certainly the print job on this, this looks and feels like an independently printed book, the type of thing that you might self-publish on Amazon. I would know. I've done that. It doesn't look very good. But it's either that, it's either a rush job, or it is just whatever research he did, he just could not find enough to really bring the reader in and intrigue the reader on this topic. And rather than just nixing the idea, which is probably a fair play if you've been going at it for a couple of months and you just don't have that much material, it might be a fair idea to just nix the idea or maybe turn it into a pamphlet, an article or something like that. He still pushed out this kind of half-formed book that doesn't really open a lot of eyes as far as Buchanan's actual life, as far as his contributions. It doesn't really make a compelling case one way or the other as far as whether Buchanan was as bad as his reputation has suggested, or whether he was maybe a bit of a scapegoat in some senses. It doesn't really tackle that question, I find. It just kind of seems to agree with what the general consensus is. And that, again, that's fine. But when you combine all these elements together, I'm not expecting a biography to be 500 pages. I'm not expecting a biography to have these brand new revelations about an individual's life all the time. And I'm not expecting a biography to make a compelling case against the popular perception of the subject, the person that they're writing about. I'm not expecting any of these things. But if you combine everything together and you have this short ass book that doesn't make a compelling case for anything and is just underbaked as far as details go, to the point where it feels, certainly it's a step beyond what you would read on Wikipedia, but not as far as you would expect for something that you have to pay like $20 to $30 for. Combine all these things together, man, and I don't know. I don't have much time for this. So all I can say is I am looking forward to whatever this new Buchanan biography is, and whenever that comes out, I'm sure that's going to be interesting. I'm curious if anyone has read, I think there's one other prominent Buchanan biography out there, the name of which escapes me. But if any of you have read another Buchanan biography, I'm curious to hear what you think of this. But I can't, under any sort of good faith, recommend The Worst President here. I think this is just really light on everything, frankly. And it was a little bit irritating to have to zip through this, honestly, as quickly as I did. It wasn't even a chore to get through. It went really quickly, and I didn't feel like I got much of anything out of it. So what can you do? With that said, I hope you got something out of this review, even if you didn't enjoy it. Regardless, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.